Okay, hi there, welcome back, or welcome to it. Welcome. Willkommen. Bienvenue. Anyway, uh, Don Diego's. Anyway, whatever. So, this is for my Art and Authenticity class, or Art and Identity, technically, but first, in that class we do theories of art and criticism, and then we do theories of authenticity, then we tie them together. This semester has been a bit of a fusker cluck, but it's, we're trying to do what we can, right? Anyway, so this lecture is about the role of authenticity in art. Now, I'm not directly talking about authenticity in the sense of whether this is an authentic Van Gogh or whether it's like a poster reproduction or some bullshit. No, that's not what I'm talking about. Although the topic it sort of relates to tangentially. Thank you. It tangentially does connect. But anyway, no, what I'm talking about is the role of authenticity as a moral ideal in, I guess, how we live our lives and how that applies to art. So, now in class, we talked a little bit about the general theories of authenticity, and you've got some readings and some videos to look at to sort of flesh that out for you. So by now you should be familiar with authenticity as a moral ideal. The concept that there is some way to be in the world that is authentic as compared to those that are inauthentic. We talked a bit about the Rousseauian concept of the inner genius, the true inner voice that you should heed, that was very popular with the Romantic movement. And in the Romantic movement, the true inner voice was connected to the natural state of being, and we got a lot of talk about how living the urban life, living the commercial life, living the capitalist life, in some senses, alienates you from this authentic being inside. Other nuances have been put upon it. Again, there are videos that we can talk about it. For Nietzsche, the only authentic life was the heroic life, if you will. That anything other than doing great things simply because they're there to do, right? You ever heard someone say, why did I climb the mountain? Because it was there, right? That something is worth doing just because it's hard is a very Nietzschean heroic authenticity kind of idea. That it's worth doing because it's difficult. There is the Sartrean idea of authenticity as just exercising your freedom, right? Making choices that have not been dictated to you by society and so forth. Similarly, Heidegger had the idea that to be authentic was to stand apart from yourself and critique the way in which you were living in the world and do it consciously and willfully, which may involve changing things, or it may not, but as long as you do it willfully. If you're just going through the motions and you're waking up every day and living your life without thinking about why you're living it that way, you're not authentic. But if you do think about it and come to the conclusion that you like your life and you're happy to live it that way, then you are authentic, even though nothing about how you're living your life has changed. Right? In Heidegger, this is the Dasein, the way of being in the world. Camus puts a nice point on it when he says, look, the only really philosophically interesting question is, why not commit suicide? Which sounds dark. But the point he's trying to make is that if you wake up every day and just keep living because you haven't thought about it, then that's not, you don't own your life. Your life is just a set of external influences. But if you wake up and you consciously realize that if you didn't want to be alive, you could stop at any time. I can stop any time. You really can, though. Right? There's a million ways to do it. You can punch your ticket anytime you want. Which means that once you realize that, every day that you are living is a conscious choice. You have made a decision to be alive, because you could just as easily have made the decision to not be alive. Or not to be alive. Sorry, I hate splitting pennies. Someone is doing grass trimming outside, which is very helpful for the lesson. I feel it gives you a sense of reality. No, anyway. In any case, the common thread running through all of these is the idea of choice and expressing sort of inner values as opposed to simply being a vessel for values that are imposed upon you from the outside. Authenticity is inherently connected to the idea of something personal and idiosyncratic, and maybe even in some sense that is not completely intelligible to anyone else. Even if you live your authentic life and express your authentic self, there's a sense in which your authentic being is something that only you can truly know. That is never going to be wholly accessible to the outside, to people outside of your head. Because, thank you, Mr. Grass Person, because the reason why it's not wholly intelligible is because if you're going to express yourself, expression in a language, either a linguistic format or some kind of symbolic format by the trading and use of aesthetic symbols, requires a mutually shared symbol set. If I'm going to say something to you, I'm going to say blur, 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 blur. That's what I authentically feel, but you will understand it. I have to express it in words that you will understand. I would like a burrito supreme with extra red sauce. See, that's what I authentically feel. But is it really? Because my authentic feeling is more elemental. It's a feeling, literally. The words refer to the feeling, but they are not the feeling, you see. So, authenticity, then, is always, in its various conceptions, is a moral ideal. Authenticity is always some variation of trying to express your inner truth and be your true self or live your true self, whatever that means. But the problem is, your true self is something that is trapped inside your own head. And the ways that you can express it to the outside world are limited to things that did not originate within you. Language, shared cultural references, things like that, those aren't yours. They belong to the society at large. And so there is in a sense, a struggle to be authentic. The struggle that marks all of these theories of authenticity is the struggle to be authentic with only the tools available to you that are not authentically yours. Right? How to cobble together and express your authenticity using what is available to you that preceded your existence, that preceded any thought of your own authenticity, stuff that is, in a sense, alienated from you. How do you make that yours and make yourself yours in that environment? Okay, so given that, and again, that was a very quick tour through authenticity. You're going to have to refer to the other materials to get the whole story on that stuff. But given that, where that puts us now is, how does what role does authenticity play in art and our responses to art? And obviously, with that kind of setup, I hope you can kind of see where this is going. And that is that art is, in a very real sense, art is, how to put this exactly? Well, art is innovative, right? That's the whole point of it. It can be formulaic and cliche and so forth. But at its best, or so we tend to think, art is innovative. It does something new and original, and it expresses something, right? Again, we talk about our theories of art. What are the criteria for good art? What are the various criteria for good art? We talk about how some people think originality is something very important in art, and other people maybe not so much. We talked about how some people think that art needs to say something, it needs to express or communicate something. Well, you can see how both of those ideas, separate though they are, sort of dovetail if we start to think about art as an expression of one's authenticity, that art must be authentic. And then, of course, it makes sense that we would want art to be original in at least some way, and that we would want it to say something or provide the opportunity to contemplate something, to put some idea in front of the viewer, in front of the audience. Because if we think that the function of art is as maybe the best vector for living authentically, then those two things become very important. Why would art be an ideal vector for expressing one's authenticity, for living and being in the world in an authentic way? Well, obviously, part of the point of art is to take established symbols and to combine them and use them in unusual ways. Part of what art can do, right? If I want to tell you directions to someplace, it's better if I use language in the very conventional sense, in the way that you're used to, because it has a functional purpose then, right? I'm trying to communicate a specific thing that you need to know, how to get to the Taco Bell, so you can pick up my burrito scream. I'm hungry, can you tell? Anyway, that's crucial, that I not, say, get very creative with the language. But in injecting creativity into the language, my own peculiar turn of phrase, my own way of saying things, then, well, as I make it my own, right? I think almost everyone you know probably has some unusual little verbal tics or ways of saying things, particular ways that they express themselves. And that is taking this external, this shared, alienated symbol set of language and adding a bit of your authentic self to it, right, to make it really yours, right? And these artistic flourishes, where we take the standard wardrobe pieces and we combine them in ways that are identifiably ours, where we have little things we do around the house that are ours in particular, rather than being done in simply the standard way. These are artistic, these are aesthetic choices, and in those aesthetic choices, we realize our authenticity. And if we realize our authenticity in aesthetic flourishes upon functional or pragmatic exercises, then perhaps, arguably, the best way to realize our authenticity is to subtract out the pragmatic altogether and reduce the field to simply bundles of aesthetic choices, which is to say, the creation of art. Okay, so This is what this is. You don't have to buy this, right? You could maintain that the authenticity is bullshit and that the function of art is to make hotel rooms look pretty. That's fine. I'm just putting forth this concept. But that is the shape of the argument, right? Is that our aesthetic choices are our most authentic choices, if you will, or they can be, right? We'll talk about that in a second. And our and art is therefore, as the creation of art is simply just a series of aesthetic choices, then without any pragmatic choices to interfere, or with minimal pragmatic choices anyway, then art is an ideal vessel for realizing our authenticity. Okay. So that's how that goes. The theory, that's a theory of how authenticity is connected to art. Okay, let's see how this plays out and if this accords with some of our other ideas or intuitions about art. And I think it does. I think there's a lot of plausibility here. Okay, so one thing that this accords with is our common sense ideas on what it means to sell out, right? A lot of people talk about artists selling out. Now, what does that mean? Right? What do you mean when you think an artist has sold out? Well, I think the rough and ready conception is that we think an artist is making art that they would not have otherwise chosen to make. And they're doing it for money, fame, drugs, whatever, right? They're doing it for the VIP passes to Disney World, whatever perk they're getting out of it. They're making art that, all things being equal, they would not have chosen to make. Okay, so there's a subplot that runs through the movie That Thing You Do about this, where a musician, they get a record deal, but he does not want to record songs that are not his. He does not want to record songs out of the catalog that the record company owns. And he quits. He decides not to take the record deal. He's not the good guy, but anyway, the point is, it is the way that we use the term selling out, I think, means that in most cases in culture, we use that term with approbation. In other words, we use it disparagingly. But why would that be a bad thing if the art in question is competently executed? If skill was really the primary criteria of art, why would we care if a musician sold out as long as they did it well? Right? Well, I think what underlies that intuition, the sort of inchoate idea that people have, is that our aesthetic choices, above all, should be authentic, right? Is that, the normativity is weird, I'll grant you. Who's to say what my aesthetic choices should be, right? That seems a little weird. But even that answer, right? If I say, well, no one gets to dictate my aesthetic choices, is kind of a plea for authenticity, right? Why would I think that no one gets to dictate my aesthetic choices? Well, because I think aesthetic choices should be authentic, right? That's why I would think that. We don't have the same attitude about a lot of other kinds of choices. My pragmatic choices in life are circumscribed by the actions and decisions of many other people, and we're okay with that, right? If I say, well, I want to drive on the left side of the road, people say, well, you don't get to do that here. So suck it up, buttercup, drive on the right side, right? Nobody would have any patience for that, right? My authenticity, or we don't feel that those kinds of pragmatic choices should be authentic, right? They're not, no one cares about whether they're authentic. They're pragmatic. But if we have strong feelings, sort of gut feelings about, we have strong gut feelings about, who should be able to tell us how to wear our hair, or how to dress, or what kind of music to enjoy, and things like that, right? And what is the distinction between the choice of what side of the road should I drive on, and how I'm going to wear my hair? The distinction is that one is a pragmatic choice that involves living in the world and negotiating space with other people, and the other one is an aesthetic choice. So I think there is a strong intuitive pull that we all experience, or most of us experience, on the idea that our aesthetic choices should be authentic, and that in fact making authentic aesthetic choices is one core element of realizing our autonomy, our free will, or our free agency in society. So we use the boogeyman of people not being free to make art, not being free to consume art, as a shorthand for people being denied their autonomy, right? Think of various dystopias where, the part of the way that they communicate that it is a dystopia is that people, they don't listen to music, or they don't, or they eat the same boring meal every day, or they wear matching clothing, or something like that. In other words, that they do not get to make aesthetic choices. They do not get to express their authenticity because they are denied their autonomy, their governance over themselves. Autonomy, according to some arguments, the main moral value of autonomy is that we get to be authentic, right? Is that the moral importance of autonomy is in the freedom to be our authentic selves. So, but that's going far afield. That gets into social philosophy, where we talk about the question of whether it's any good to have autonomy, technically speaking, if your society is arranged in such a fashion that all kinds of choices that you might authentically make are off the table for you. But that's a different class. So there's a strong intuitive pull to the idea that our aesthetic choices not only can be authentic, but should be. We decry the artist who sells out, who makes art that is not aesthetically what they would choose, but is aesthetically what the audience wants. We decry people who only listen to popular music, or who follow the crowd and dress exactly like the popular styles rather than being themselves. Right? Why would we decry those choices? Why would we condemn those kinds of choices? Because we think they aren't choices, right? We feel that this person is not actually living authentically, right? They are just copying the aesthetic preferences of other people for acceptance or something else. So again, these kinds of intuitive judgments that we make are underpinned, whether we realize it or not, by a commitment to the idea that authenticity involves making your own aesthetic choices as you see fit. Okay. This also ties in, as you will see in the readings, to the idea of cultural appropriation. And this was a little harder to articulate as to how this ties in. Because on the one hand, some people are going to say, hey, look, if I really like, Peruvian culture, and I make art in the Peruvian style, then I'm being authentic, right? What's wrong with that? And some people say, yeah, that's kind of cultural appropriation, dude. That's not your culture. So how can I say that it is not authentic? Well, this brings us to a relatively recent theory of authenticity articulated by Charles Taylor, who's a Canadian philosopher. And I read his book, The Ethics of Authenticity, a long time ago, I think in 2008. many years ago, in other words, in the dim past. Maybe it was 2009, but I think it was 2008. 2009 would be practically modern. 2008, that's just forever ago. I read his book and I didn't get it. But I've reread it since then, and I do appreciate it now. In fact, I think he's on to something. Taylor thinks that authenticity is a moral ideal, yes. But that the kind of authenticity, the radical freedom that Sartre talks about, the radical kind of separation from your everyday self that Heidegger is talking about, that these things are not, they're missing a trick. Just because I grew up with something doesn't mean it's not a part of me, right? It doesn't mean it. Let's go back to the Rousseauian conception, which is maybe the polar opposite of Charles Taylor's conception. The Rousseauian conception of authenticity, the inner voice that speaks to you, right, that says, do this, right, listen to your heart, follow your dreams, what have you, right? It finds its expression via romantic literature in modern culture in all kinds of ways. The Romantic movement was hugely influential on our culture today. You should learn about it if you get a chance. But anyway, this posits that there is a core person that existed, or that exists kind of separate from and in spite of all of the influences around you as society. And this is tied to Rousseau's theories of the self, where he thinks that a person that grew up sort of in the woods by themselves, like Nell from the movie Nell, would still have a fully developed personality and set of desires and things like that because of that inner self. And what Taylor says is that's probably not true, based on what we now understand about psychology that Rousseau didn't. He said, look, yes, there are influences, there are aesthetic paradigms, moral ideas, attachments, all kinds of things that come into you from the outside, from before you're even able to evaluate them critically. And he does think that Heidegger is right, that you do need to evaluate things critically. You need to be aware. But he says those are you. Those are a part of you, right? Even if they are a part of you in the sense that you reject them, right? Maybe there are things from your upbringing that you reject violently, vehemently, but they are still there in the negative, right? In the fact that you feel a need to reject them specifically, right? It's not like they're, completely off the radar, right? It's not like some forgotten dance, right? Like the gavotte that used to be in fashion. It isn't now, and you never learned it. It's the Easter eggs in my lectures that I hope you guys enjoy. Anyway, it's not like that, right? It's something that you did grow up with, and that was a part of your life, and now you reject it, but the rejection of it informs who you are. The rejection of it is a part of your authentic self. Being the authentic self, being the carefully considered self, the self-aware self, the way of being in the world that is conscious of your being in the world, the Dasein. Taylor says that we can't separate out these elements, right? We can decide the stance we will take on them, but we can't change them. We can't erase them, right? We are who we are, and we come from where we come from. And we can step back and critically assess all of these things and decide what role each of those influences and each of those events and histories and communities will play in our life today. We can do that every day and change our minds as we go. But we can't take them off the table. They are who we are. We are the sum of our experiences and our reactions to those experiences. I see a meme going around sometimes, you are not what happened to you. You are, according to Taylor. You are everything that happened to you, but you are also how you choose to react to what happened to you. So, how does cultural appropriation relate to this idea that art should be authentic? Well, now that we've set up with Taylor's interpretation of authenticity, it becomes much easier to grasp the concept of cultural appropriation. If I am making art in the Peruvian style, that's not really authentic to me. That is not a part of my history, my upbringing, or anything. It's something I like. I can appreciate it, but I'm never going to be on the inside of it. I will always and only be appreciating Peruvian art from the outside as a non-Peruvian. I don't know why Peru came up. It's the first thing that I came up with. Anyway. So, I'm not even really sure what Peruvian art looks like, I gotta tell you. But, if I am Peruvian, then I can make art in the traditional fashion, and it can be authentic. I could make art that is a rejection of the traditional elements, like consciously and clearly and explicitly so, and it will be authentic. I can make art that has nothing to do with my Peruvian background and draws instead upon the other influences in my life, and that would be authentic. But for someone who does not have that in their background, in other words, for someone for whom that is not a part of who they are, to make the Peruvian art is, in a sense, an inauthentic aesthetic choice. I am expressing preferences for enjoying Peruvian art, but in making it, I am arrogating to myself. I am, in a sense, claiming that there are things in my past, in my authentic makeup, that are not there. Right? So, yeah, I cannot make Peruvian art because I am not Peruvian, and I do not have any share in that culture. I can like it. I can make stuff that maybe looks like it, although that's a little dicey. So that is the argument, or the authenticity argument. There are other arguments, pragmatic, moral, so on and so forth. But that is the authenticity-based argument against cultural appropriation. That if we have an overriding moral obligation to be authentic, and that if art plays a key role, if art takes a pride of place, if you will, in the expression and realization of our authenticity in our lives, well, gosh, to make art that is not actually authentic, that's just about the worst thing I can do, right? That would be just about the biggest betrayal of my authenticity, of my moral obligation to be authentic, that I could think of. So, okay. So that's the authenticity argument for not doing cultural appropriation. Do not do the cultural appropriation. Okay. And finally, this notion of authenticity ties into, as hinted at earlier, our intuitions about aesthetic expression in terms of the aesthetic universes we create for ourselves. Especially if we take a page from Taylor, and we combine that with our idea that aesthetic choices are perhaps paradigmatically authentic choices, then what we come up with is the idea that even if we cannot create art in the traditional sense, we can structure our aesthetic universes. We can make aesthetic choices in how we present ourselves to the world, how we dress, what kind of music we listen to, what kind of television shows we like, the movies we consume, how we decorate our homes and our spaces and our cars and so forth. Every aesthetic choice we make is an opportunity to structure the symbolic aesthetic universe in which we live in a way that reflects who we are authentically. Right. So, this ties in with one theory of authenticity expressed by Alessandro Ferrara, an Italian philosopher, if you couldn't have guessed, who has a wonderful little book called Reflective Authenticity, one of many things he's written. Ferrara, the TLDR on Ferrara is that your life is a work of art, which is a kind of nice poetic way of saying that I just am, in a sense, my aesthetic choices. Remember how I said, there's that meme, you're not what happened to you. And then Charles Taylor says, you are what happened to you, but also how you react to it. Right, following on from Heidegger and the Dasein. We might imagine that Alessandro Ferrara would say, you are what happened to you, but also how you react to it. And the way that you express those reactions is in the sum total of your aesthetic universe, right? So, in a sense, all of my aesthetic choices, not just as an artist, but I may not be an artist, but as a person living in the world and trying to live authentically, my aesthetic choices are the realization of my authenticity, right? That is like the outward sign of my living authentically, right? And this makes a certain amount of sense psychologically. Think of the sense of comfort and well-being and personal fulfillment we get from things that, on a practical level, shouldn't offer any of those. Right? On a practical level, I think I would feel comfort from like knowing I had a roof over my head and food and a job and things like that. But all of those things sometimes seem to pale by comparison when I discover that an old show I used to love from my youth is available on streaming somewhere, and I can watch it. And that's stupid, but it's also not. It's not stupid at all, because those aesthetic choices, the aesthetic choice to appreciate that, the aesthetic investment I have in it, is real and substantial. It is a big part of my history and who I am. And so, when I go back and do that, I am actualizing myself. I am actualizing on my authentic self. And that's, at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? We take care of the practical shit, and then we work our way up to self-actualization. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. M-A-S-L-O-W. Maslow hierarchy of needs. But that's the, I'm not saying Maslow is right, but I think he's on to something about self-actualization being a core element, right? I think he's talking about authenticity there, whether he knows it or not. Our aesthetic choices are important to us. And no, they're not practical, but they're important to us because they're not practical. Practical choices are of a necessity impersonal. In a certain sense, you can say, all things being equal, anyone in this position would have made X practical choice, whatever practical choice we're talking about, right? Anyone would have decided to drive on the right side of the road, because that's the best way not to get in a wreck, right? In practical choices that we make to live in the world are, in a very real sense, de-individuated. Whereas it is the non-practical choices that are individuated, that are authentic to us as individual people. And that is why they are, in some sense, more significant than the practical choices. People are used to devaluing the aesthetic choices because of their impracticality. I'm saying that under this theory, they are valued because of their impracticality, because they are choices that would be made, that are made solely every individual in that situation is going to make a different choice with regards to those, if they are being authentic. So, okay. All right, so to wrap this up, what does this tell us about artists? What is the function of the artist? Well, under this theory, the function of the artist is to be authentic, right? And in a certain sense, the artist providing us with pretty things or things that are aesthetically enjoyable, what have you, is a secondary function. That for artists' first and primary obligation is simply to their own authentic self. This is a shift. Up until the medieval era, art was looked at as a trade skill. There was no sense of personal expression in it. Art is something you do to decorate spaces, okay, or to decorate time. We're talking about music. But anyway, sometime in, I'm going to say, starting with the Academy in France, so 17th, 18th century, we get this shift towards art as a vessel of your authentic self. And this follows on from what some call the discovery of the individual in the Renaissance. If you want to know more about that, take humanities too. The point is, the motto, ars gratia artis, art for the sake of art, expresses this very nicely. What is the point of this art? The point of this art is for it to be made, right? It is, in a sense, a little bit of that heroic notion, right? Someone says, why did you write that book? Because no one had, right? Art is to be made for the sake of the artist. That is the primary function of this theory. Artists are just there to be authentic. Their role is not to make pleasant things for us to look at in hotel lobbies. Their role is to be themselves. Now, as a secondary function, they can help us to give us a richer symbol set, if you will, by taking the established symbols that are available for use, and I don't mean just language, I mean sort of symbolic communication, uses of shape, color, things like that. This is all semiotics. S-E-M-I-O-T-I-C-S, semiotics. It's a fascinating field. By taking the established symbols and confounding them and subverting them and using them in new ways, and combining them in new ways, artists, in a sense, create new symbolic vocabularies for us, new ways in which we might express ourselves. And again, note that if this theory is right, that one of the ways, if Ferrara is right, one of the ways that we express ourselves, our authenticity, is not simply by making art, but by consuming it. So the artist who is serving their own authenticity by creating art is also abetting our authenticity by creating art for us to incorporate into our symbolic universe, our aesthetic universe, and with which we can make aesthetic choices to include that or not, and thereby express our authenticity. Okay. So, this idea that the artist is ultimately just supposed to be authentic. Now, this latter concept that the artist is maybe also helping you along the path to your authenticity reaches, it informs anyway, at least partially, the movement of abstract expressionism, wherein the artist creates something that has no definitive meaning, that does not say something, but that instead prompts you to figure out what it means to you. In other words, to make radically free aesthetic choices, if you will, to borrow some language from Sartre. So, okay. So the artist as the authentic individual. This is where we get this romantic notion of the artist. And the romantic idea of the artist does start in a Rousseauian kind of place, where the artist has this kind of irresistible inner genius that must be heeded. I need to paint, right? But even if we run it all the way up to Charles Taylor's conception of authenticity, the idea of the artist as a paradigmatically authentic person is still relevant, because the artist is taking all of these things in their history and their background and making expressions, aesthetic expressions about them. That if the Dasein is us stepping back and taking a critical look at all of our influences and who we are and where we came from and deciding how we feel about it, art, you might say, is the Dasein, the process of the Dasein made manifest, made visible in the case of paintings, made audible in the case of music. It is the artist's thoughts on themselves and their authentic history turned into an expression that maybe you can relate to. So, whereas up until the Middle Ages, artists were simple tradespeople, with the coming of the Romantic conception of authenticity, and you get a Romantic conception of the artist, and the artist as a truly authentic person, sort of heroic figure, a rebel that stands out from the crowd, and maybe is an example to us. And we can, again, this tracks very well with a lot of established cultural notions of art and artists, right? They're supposed to have wisdom and insight, some kind of mystical, perception of the world. This is very much in accord with what we tend to think about artists. And so I think this notion that authenticity and aesthetic choices are at the root of authenticity is extremely plausible. It sort of ties together a great deal of things that we already thought and makes sense out of all of them. And as a hermeneutic for understanding our lives, our lived experiences, it's extremely useful. So, does that make it right? I don't know. Do you want to be an artist who just sells commercial jingles? Knock yourself out. I don't know, man. I feel like we should be authentic. I feel there's a moral imperative. Because to take a line from Sartre and Camus, if you're not authentic, you're not really anything. Right? You aren't. There is no you. There's just a bunch of reflexes instilled upon you from outside. There's just a bunch of stuff that you aren't. The meat sack that your brain drives around is just there to parrot other people's aesthetic choices. That there is only a you when the Dasein is sort of in operation, when we are stepping back and looking critically, and we have that self-consciousness, and we make choices. So, yeah, in a sense, maybe being authentic isn't a moral imperative so much as an existential imperative. It's not so much that you're a bad person if you're not authentic. It's that you're not really a person, properly speaking, at all. Whew, that's heavy. I don't know how to feel about that. But something to think about anyway. Chew on that. And we'll talk about that more, at a later date. Do the readings, watch the other videos, and, okay, be well.